For more than 200 years, gerrymandering has been used by politicians for partisan purposes to the Republic's detriment.
And you know where it comes from? The state of Massachusetts, you know that.
Yes, I know Governor Jerry in about 1812 or something.
Even before that.
Politicians picking their voters rather than the voters picking their politicians distorts and undermines the integrity of our electoral process. Gerrymandering distorts fair outcomes by minimizing the votes of some while increasing the potency of others. It suppresses voter turnout. Why vote if the outcome is preordained? And undermines a fundamental part of democracy, the ability of people to hold their politicians accountable. All of this erodes the public's trust. Presidents as diverse as Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama have urged its end. But for those 200 years, efforts to eliminate it have failed. Politicians have resisted reform, saying line drawing is inherently partisan or needs expert, but no more. The California model for redistricting, by its process, level of public participation and transparency, has proven that the people can draw fair, transparent, nonpartisan, and non-gerrymandered districts representing the people. The California process was the people's process. Application to the commission was open to all Californians. Extensive outreach was conducted to encourage communities not normally engaged in the political process to apply. In the end, more than 30,000 started the application, while nearly 5,000 completed the rigorous process. Moreover, the application was completely transparent. Candidates' applications were open to all, from financial information to essay answers to live interviews of the final 120. The result was a commission that was California. 8 men, 6 women, 3 Anglos, 4 Latinos, 2 African Americans, 3 Asians, a Native American, and a Pacific Islander, and all, whether Democrat, Republican, or non-aligned, nonpartisan, and committed to creating fair districts. The commission encouraged the public to engage. It held 34 public hearings and 70 deliberation meetings, each of which provided opportunity for public input. We met in 32 cities and 23 counties with more than 2,700 speakers and with written submissions from an additional 2,000 groups and more than 20,000 individuals. The commission also sought transparency. The meetings were broadcast live. All comments were posted on our website. The meetings were transcribed and translated into 7 languages. Interpreters were provided, as was disabled access. We had no private meetings. We did not use prior maps, no party registration, or even where the incumbents lived. But it wasn't just numbers and transparency. The public could see in real time the direct impact of their comments. The line drawing at the commission debates were entirely public. The commission had to explain and justify why each district was drawn the way it was. The state Supreme Court characterized the districts as being a product of an open, transparent, and nonpartisan redistricting process. Unlike prior redistricting, the public could trust the integrity of the process and the result. The commission and its process provides a model any state or governmental entity can use for redistricting. It is a high bar, but our democracy deserves no less.
So what is this thing that we've created, and can it be replicated? There are 3 basic elements of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. First, it is a human-centered process. That second comes out of a process that was deliberative and involved unusual political bedfellows, both in the creation but ultimately in how it was carried out. And third, it lifted up the principles of public engagement, transparency, political fairness, and public trust. What we created in 2008 came out of 3 years of a deliberative process where we brought together business, labor, environmental, civil rights, good government, and many other organizations and leaders to talk about what was possible in transforming government so that it could be functional, so that it could be responsive, and so that it could be trusted. In many ways, the process that created the Citizens Redistricting Commission was reflected in the Citizens Redistricting Commission itself and how it deliberated. In subsequent years, we used this same deliberative process to help develop transformative processes around ballot initiative reform, term limits reform, and even reforming campaign finance laws that were passed with bipartisan support and an unusual coalition of political bedfellows. Since 2011, cities like Austin, Sacramento, Minneapolis, and Santa Fe have all adopted Citizens Redistricting Commissions. And at the state level, states like Illinois, Ohio, Missouri, and Michigan are pushing for similar kinds of changes. The genius of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission is not that it was a perfect, immutable model. It's not that it was made up of 14 people or 100 hearings or any of the other mechanics. It is that it inspired people throughout the country to tackle what for 200 years was seen as impossible to tackle in the political sphere. Whether it's cities or states or even our Supreme Court, we now aspire to reform our democratic institutions to be more inclusive of all voices and ultimately to create a government that, as President Obama says, reflects our better selves.
Yes, Linda.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the outcomes? And I think sort of measuring it by how many contested seats and how it, if it has diversified the representatives that have been elected?
Well, it certainly has made it more, there's been a lot of turnover and change as a result. I can't remember the exact numbers, but we had no competitive congressional districts in California before the thing. We now have 9. We had 30.
And out of how many? Just get
53. 53 members of Congress. We have 80 members of the Assembly. We have 38 new ones. This is the 2012 election that came out of it. We were considered. I think Politico did an analysis of what was the most competitive state in the union, and we were first, and Idaho was second. So there's been a real turnover, and I can tell you stories about some of the elections, and it was because it was such a nonpartisan process. You saw traditionally powerful representatives put into the same district and have to run against each other, and a lot of representatives chose not to run because of the districts were changed and in a non-gerrymandered fashion. So there was a lot of impact.
Before the Redistricting Commission was created, we heard from civil rights groups and also women's groups that complained about the fact that in California, as in many states where the legislature draws the lines, that they were playing 3D chess. And if somebody aspired to run for a Senate seat and they used to be an assembly person, your relationship with the president pro tem of the Senate absolutely mattered. And if you weren't on the inside, if you weren't part of the old boys club, you were excluded. You were specifically, a district would be drawn for someone else. And oftentimes that punishment would have a significant impact on the communities of people who might be emerging, who might choose to support a challenger. So in many ways, what the Redistricting Commission did in drawing lines that really reflected this huge amount of community testimony was to be responsive to our demographic changes as they were coming, instead of always looking backwards to cementing the power structures that were.
Yes, Pete, thank you.
So the reason we're in this predicament is because the self-interest rightly understood of legislators is to maintain power over these decisions. And it took a ballot initiative in California, Prop 11, to make this happen, which was not an insignificant undertaking. As we look at the question of how easy this is to transfer either to other states or municipalities, does it have to go through that kind of outsider process, or do you see prospects for the better angels, so to speak,
Well, I think that's something
to
both
be
can
at work
respond
here?
to.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see it happen in 3 ways. One, you're going to have the states which have an initiative process of some sort. The public interest will put it on the ballot. The second group is the courts, which are now in the process of considering a case in Supreme Court case that will be argued this fall, may determine that you cannot partisan gerrymander. And in those cases where the court rules that, we're in a position sort of be more or less plunked down as an example that the state can use. Also, I think that with the renewed activism in the country, that you will see, even in those states that just have a legislature, the public will put pressure on the legislators to say, look, if you don't do this, we will vote you out of office. We will hold you accountable. And so it will become from sort of a backwater issue, I think. It will become an issue really on the forefront and will become a basis on which people say, I'm going to vote for you or not.
You ask a good question. So I agree with Stan that it's not limited to initiative states. I think it's important to look at where the reforms have already been implemented. sometimes so quickly that we didn't even realize it, right? So the city of Austin in Texas, for instance, looked at what just happened in California, said, that's good. Why don't we try that at a local level? And in fact, actually, many smaller jurisdictions have adopted some version of a citizen-engaged process. I won't call it always a citizens commission, but a process where they've looked at California's model and they said, this makes sense for us, right? And when you think about it, that's the beginning for percolating change all the way up to the national level, because the people who are elected at the city level eventually become your legislators at the state level, and because that process is something that they take as a norm, not as an exception, it may become something that filters up to that national level about what we should be doing for all elections. The last piece is that I think that the Supreme Court case coming out of Wisconsin, but also two more, one in Maryland and one in North Carolina, each represent the possibility that at one time the Supreme Court was very skeptical about, right? They always used to say, well, redistricting is fundamentally a political process, and they don't know how to get the politics out of it, particularly this kind of hyper-partisanship. We have seen in the last 2 years a sea change in the language that's coming from the Supreme Court to say, you know what, actually, maybe we can do something about it. And there are some limits to hyperpartisan gerrymandering. And we see that coming out of the states that are innovating, but even for the states that don't have an initiative process, what can we do to create some bounds? I think that's where the sanity starts coming.
I also, let me as well other comment. I think also goes beyond the line drawing, because any state can look at California and say, whatever the issue is, this is what public participation looks like, this level of public engagement. This is what transparency looks like. And those are, I think, useful models for things beyond line drawing.
David?
The data about the 2012 elections is just stunning. I mean, for a decade, you'd had one new congressperson from California, one new member of the state legislature, and all of a sudden, 38 out of 80 assembly members were new, 9 out of 40 senators, 4 congress people. So we sort of are duty bound to ask, was there some other factor, or was this all because of redistricting?
I'm not here. Not sure that I know enough to say about other factors, but I know that redistricting had a role to play.
There were a number of reforms that happened at the same time. So for those people who follow California or live in it, we also had primary reforms, and shortly thereafter term limits reforms, right? But I would say that what happened in 2012 was that because the commission was drawing without regard to where incumbents lived, and they were being very responsive to community testimony about changing demographics, all of a sudden the lines that they drew were not as responsive to the existing power structure and much more responsive to the community testimony. And what that meant was that a lot of incumbents were displaced, but it also meant that there were a lot more seats that were toss-ups between sometimes Democrats and Republicans, but a lot of times also between Democrats or between Republicans, right? And it was never a given. That meant that for some people, for the first time in 20, 30 years, they actually had to earn their votes and go out and campaign and talk to voters. It changed the dynamic in so many elections in a way that I think voters really felt like, wow, this thing that we created has so many effects because now I get to see and hear and feel like I actually have a choice when it comes to my representative.
Just a question too about, again, looking at transferability and to your point, Stan, about this hyperpartisanship that we're in. The final 14 members of the Redistricting Commission were comprised of 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 independents.
Correct.
I know painfully all too well that is not representative of the party registration of the state. Do you think that that is something that can be replicated in deep blue states or deep red states, that intentionality of trying to balance the commission around what are very political decisions?
I think the answer is yes. Once you've made the judgment that you're going to try and have an independent commission, once you've made that judgment, then you will go out and you will find, and you go through this process of picking your individuals. The nature of the process picks people who are basically good government, nonpartisan types. They may be Republicans, they may be Democrats, but they basically want a system that works, that's responsive to the people. And so the partnership vanishes. In fact, it's interesting. They always thought we would fail at the beginning because we'd be partisan. And you got into the meetings, and there was a complete absence of partisanship. We just wanted to have a good result that met the public's needs
And you see that because of the selection process.
because of the selection process.
And and what was the vote? Like, you needed a majority to pass the maps, but you also needed a majority of each of the three
Well,
sectors.
right, exactly.
Is that it?
And that was important. That was the key factor in how this system worked. The Arizona system had an independent commission, but the Democrats picked 2, Republicans picked 2, and they picked the other one. So you ended up with the Democrats voting against Republicans, and so only the chair had a vote that mattered. In our case, we had 3 separate caucuses, and each caucus had to approve the maps, and then come back, because if you had 3, 3, and 3, that'd give you 9. You had to have a supermajority. And if we didn't agree, that did not happen, but if we didn't agree, we would have to go back and re-argue it to where each group was satisfied that this map was the right map.
Process drew, kind of pushed the result.
We have been going through a process of deliberation with other states, as I mentioned. And so in states like Michigan, one of the biggest concerns is, well, if we have 3 buckets of commissioners and you have to have a certain number of votes from each one of those buckets, aren't you just going to lead to gridlock? Because if you can't get that requisite number of votes, then the whole thing gets stalemated. And what we think is that in the California process, because what we were doing was A, not having the legislature directly choose those people, but B, also removing this kind of direct conflict of interest where people might feel ties to parties or special interests, but they were really coming from a space of being civically engaged, but just not owing loyalties to particular incumbents or parties. It changes the decision dynamic, right? And what we saw with the California process was that these 14 people who did not know each other at the beginning of the Survivor game, right? That's probably not a good analogy, but they didn't know each other, right? But by the end of it, they had, you went through a hazing process where you had to go through 100 hearings all around the state, and it really caused them to have a kind of respect and bonding with each other that allowed them to have a near unanimous decision on all of the maps, right? That's significant, and I think it signals a larger possibility for what we can do to make government functional as a whole.
We really formed a band of brothers.
Thank you very much. That was
Right.
very good. Very, very well done.